I love cyberpunk. I love the neon nightlife. I love the cyborg transhumanism. I love endlessly arguing with people on the internet about whether the punk suffix indicates that the genre should be inherently left-wing and anti-authoritarian, or whether it's actually much more apolitical and nihilistic. I don't actually like that one's quite tedious. But cyberpunk is a genre that I love and that I've always had a lot of emotional investment in, even before CD Projekt Red dropped their 2020 smash hit, Get Negged by Uncle Keanu Simulator. I've got a decade of making games professionally as a designer, producer and academic in games and cultural studies. Here on the Indie Game Clinic, people send me the games they're working on to get my feedback on things they can do to improve as designers and developers. Today I'm looking at Neon Sword, a love letter to the top-down open world early GTA games set in a sleazy cyberpunk future. This game was sent to me by someone called Japes, a solo developer working under the studio name P-Head Games. Japes explains some of the history around the game and why they've stuck with a relatively simple art style due to being a programmer more than an artist. Now, I'm not going to talk about every element of this game because there's quite a lot going on here, to be honest, and I think a lot of the problems we're going to see are really just the result of a one-person team just trying to make a game that's too big for them. So instead, I'm just going to focus on the strongest and weakest elements of this project. I'm surprised to hear that Japes doesn't consider himself an artist, because overall I think the aesthetic of this game rocks. So let's talk about the visual style first before we move on to the actual game design. Now, the line work used in the loading screen visuals for this game doesn't really fit with the 3D. It's fine to mix 3D art styles with 2D illustration, but there need to be some rules that are shared between the two styles of art. Look at this example from Dredge. The characters here are 2D illustrations, but they look like they belong in the same world as the 3D ship. They follow similar visual logic. There are no outlines in either things, and even the cell shading in the 3D world is replicated here by having a few different stages of color rather than a smooth grade. This is how you make 2D illustrations work in a game that is otherwise 3D. They need to match up, they need to have something in common. These illustrations are okay, but they're in a comic book style which doesn't really match up with the minimalist 3D approach of the rest of the game. Speaking of the 3D, I think this is an area where the game actually really shines. I can find some presentation faults with the game, like the inconsistent use of typography and this really garish magenta which feels a bit overused. But when you combine this minimalist 3D aesthetic with some of the quite creepy sound design and the relative sparseness of the city, you end up with a feeling of a world which is less of a bustling metropolis and something much colder and bleaker. Quaid City is quite an appealing setting. There are cars to steal, there are criminals to converse with, and there are random people to punch in the street. But there isn't much to do when you're going from place to place unless you initiate it yourself. And this is the problem with trying to make an open world game as a solo developer or as a small team. If your game is open world, it really needs to justify that it's open world by having enough to do. At the moment, I can just go from one place in this game to another, and there is nothing to surprise me along the way. Now, when they first contacted me about this game, Japes explained how they ended up with such a big city. Unlike most indies, I had a few studio jobs while developing the game, which meant I could take as long as I wanted, which is why I managed to build a whole city alone. I know not all devs have that opportunity. But I think that maybe this is part of the problem with this game, is thinking of the game as a place first rather than an activity. A game is an activity which happens in a place, it's not the place itself. And with so much time spent lovingly crafting an expansive environment, Japes may have given less focus than they should have to parts of the game which I personally think are a lot more crucial. It's a problem I've seen increase since Unreal and Unity made it easier to make 3D games. There's a glut of games out there which are really just about moving a person around in a place, and I'm not talking about walking simulators which tend to have a bit more of a point to make and a story that they want to get across. I'm really talking about people that think that building an action game is just about putting a first or third person controller in an environment. It's not. At the moment this game does have people to interact with, places to go, things to do, but they are very linear and obvious. There is nothing that happens emergently as you're wandering around the city. You should always aim for your game to be the best in genre, and that's why the advice to new indies is always to start small. Because if you make a big open world game like this, then your competitors are GTA, your competitors are Cyberpunk, and you cannot live up to that. If the premise of your game is this is GTA 2 but with a Cyberpunk theme and less stuff to do, that's not really a unique selling point for this as a product, and this is a general problem that comes from basing your indie projects on big games rather than starting small. Jape has set themselves up for potential failure because the game is always going to be compared to those titles and always found lacking. It needs to find its own thing that it's doing. It needs to find a unique selling point. But even if Japes does cut down the scope and focus in on just a few elements of being a character in a futuristic city, there are still some much more urgent moment-to-moment problems with the gameplay here, and a lot of those are to do with cameras and controls. Now, this is an area where for me the game just totally falls down. For most players, this is likely to hit before they even start a mission or get into a vehicle. Driving itself feels pretty okay, although the cars are prone to get stuck grinding along a wall like this, and they can be quite hard to reverse. The game is also very unforgiving about how close you have to be to a specific part of a car to hijack it, but by and large the game generally feels much better when you're in a vehicle than when you are travelling on foot. The default control scheme for walking uses the WASD keys and has me turning left and right with A and D and going forward and backward using W and S. So essentially it's the controls you'd expect from an FPS or over-the-shoulder third-person game, except without strafing, and it's applied to something which is top-down, which kind of might make sense when you're driving a car, but not when you're controlling a person in a top-down view. When you're running around, those default controls feel very awkward, and that kind of awkwardness is okay for a game like Octodad, where deliberate awkwardness is kind of part of the comedic tone of the game. But I get the sense that my protagonist here is supposed to feel like a cool character and not like a cybernetically enhanced version of Mr. Bean. There's an option here to switch my controls from tank to something called turn with camera direction, and I can now only run forwards and then use the mouse to turn, and there's still no strafing. There's really no need to have the rotation of the camera follow the character in a top-down world, because we're not seeing through the character's eyes or over their shoulders. I'm so dizzy, my head is spinning. In most cases, it is beneficial to keep the camera facing in one direction so that the player doesn't get lost. There's even a third set of controls I can switch to called Twin Stick, which doesn't control how you'd think. The character turns to face the mouse cursor, but they can't be freely moved in every direction, and I still can't strafe. Generally speaking, the camera is always too close to the ground, whether I'm on foot or driving a vehicle, and that makes it too hard to navigate or see where I'm going. Overall though, the issue is that you've designed 3 different sets of controls for moving the character, and none of them really feel that intuitive. My head is spinning. There is a sub-discipline within game design called the 3 C's, which refers to camera, character and controls. And the fact that AAA studios have designers dedicated to just this element should tell you everything you need to know about how difficult it is to get right. The simple rule of thumb you can use here is that your controls should be based on an existing game which is currently popular. The only situation where it makes sense chance to experiment and introduce new ways to move a character is when you know that that is going to be fun. And the only games I can think of that are examples of this would be something like Katamari Damacy, where you are learning how to move an unusual object and how the learning to move that is part of the fun. In this case, there are plenty of top-down games and it just needs to control like one of those, not give me an option of 3 different weird ways of controlling the character which all kind of just feel bad and make me feel seasick. None of the available ways for me to control my character feels like it's based on an existing language of how controls in other games work. Some parts of your game should be copied. It makes it easier for players to understand, especially when it comes to something as visceral and as rooted in muscle memory as character controls. But all in all, it's a much better idea to just try and develop one set of controls which really works, rather than giving the players 3 different options which all feel a bit bad in different ways. I think Japes is providing us another warning story about scope in game development. When you try to make a bigger game, you're not just signing up to make more content or more features, you're also usually deciding to do more people's jobs. Unless you have a team around you, that generally means you'll be dipping into a lot of disciplines where you don't really know what you're doing. I think Neon Sword shows the dangers of doing this very well. A lot of things in the game work from a functionality point of view, but they just don't feel good to interact with. The in-game aesthetic of the game is really evocative and to me is one of the game's biggest selling points, but it's at odds with what the game says it's about. The loading screens, the in-game text, all hint that this game is meant to be something bombastic, a kind of crime caper, but the moment-to-moment tone of the game and of being in the city feels much more existential dread than crime romp. All it really needs to top it off is a voiceover by Werner Herzog at some point.
Of course there's a lot of misery, but it is the same misery that is all around us.
There's a reason why players in Dredge can't get out of the boat, and why in Hotline Miami we can't get in the car and drive it around. Those developers didn't try to simulate a world, they imagined a world and then they gave the player a role and they limited the activities you do in their game to what was most relevant to that role. They made sensible decisions about scope, and that's why those games are finished and have millions and millions of fans. In its current state, Neon Sword is an example of how a game where you can do anything very quickly becomes a game with nothing to do because it's just not focused enough on a set of fun core mechanics. For this developer to be successful with Neon Sword or with future projects, they need to take this ability they already have to make evocative visual worlds and narrow down to a much thinner slice of experience for the player, focusing on what it actually feels like to do things in the moment-to-moment play of the game, rather than just being able to move around in the environment and follow quest markers. Here's a little bit of homework for all the game developers watching, but it could also apply to other creative media as well. If you've got a creative project that you're working on and you've been working on it for some time, I want you to set yourself a new target for audience testing. And that could be play testing if it's a game, it could be playing to an audience if it's a piece of music. Whatever your medium is, this is kind of relevant. But based on a quota of one person's feedback per month at an absolute bare minimum. A game like Neon Sword, which has been in development for several years now, should have been tested by dozens and dozens of people at this point. But the problems that I'm seeing here with the baseline activity of just moving around the game world indicate to me that this has not been tested very frequently. Stop whatever you're doing now and test it with a real audience. It will accelerate your development whether you're making a game or something else, but more importantly, it will help you identify whether the thing that you're currently making and spending all that time on is even worth finishing. That might sound a bit harsh, it might sound a bit mean, but the route to success in any creative discipline is to stop thinking about the individual things that you work on as if every single one is your magnum opus. Step back from it and see it for what it is. It is a project for you to learn some skills on, and if it turns out good, then it might entertain some people. In the context of game development, you're only going to be successful at that second thing of entertaining people if you truly care about game design. That is, the design of the actual gameplay and the interactions, not just the code and the art. Design means making things for other people, making something which satisfies their needs and desires better or as well as something else on the market. If you're not focused on that, you're not designing, you're just tinkering with a game engine. As always, if you've got your own thoughts or feedback for the developer based on what you've seen in my footage, leave it in the comments below. Or if you really want to be helpful, you can access the demo directly and give feedback that way. Link in the description. Buy my merch, buy my merch, buy my merch. Buy my merch, buy my merch, buy my merch, buy my merch.